All right, so welcome to the Maude and Fritz Show. This is Maude beaming to you from Southern Arizona.
And this is Fritz coming to you from Sao Paulo, Brazil.
So today's show is going to be an exciting one. It's called Borg, Season 5, Episode 23. It's one where, there's actually some emotion. It's an emotional episode, which we'll get into in a minute. So hope you like it. So let's get started. So the show starts out with the Enterprise putzing around the universe looking for alien life forms, and they discover a transmission coming out of a moon of one of the planets they're going around. And so it turns out that they see that there's a crash there, and that there's still a life form alive, though it seems kind of weak. So they decide to beam an away team to the moon to investigate. So they end up beaming Crusher, Worf, and Riker. So while they're on the moon, they see the crash. They investigate. They see a body. They uncover the body, which was buried in debris, and it turns out to be a Borg. And so they look around. There's four other Borgs that have passed away in the crash. So they call back to the bridge. They say, what do we do? We want to beam this this Borg over. And what was funny about, so they're asking Picard what they should do with it. Crusher wants to send the Borg to sick bay, and there's an argument at that point as to whether they should bring them back at all. And Worf keeps calling it. So we should kill it. And Crusher keeps saying it's a him. It's an adolescent male, and calls him him. And she says he's still alive, and Worf saying kill it. Mm-hmm. So it was interesting how they saw this entity as being completely different. Picard also, by the way, calls it in it. So he wants to. Picard says Crusher convinces Picard not to kill the Borg, but Picard says, "Well, all right, beam it to a security cell, so we can control it." And Crusher's like, "I want him to sick bay." So Picard ends up just deciding to beam the Borg to a security cell. Where he can't really escape or cause any harm. So, all right. So back on board the Enterprise, after Picard gives the instructions to beam the Borg to the security cell, he sort of, you could tell he's emotional about it, because he's had this huge incident at this point with the Borg where he was assimilated, so to speak. And he escaped that, and it was just a big traumatic scene. And so everybody's like wondering how emotionally Picard's going to handle this, being confronted with a Borg after that traumatic experience he had. So he walks off the bridge after giving the order to send the Borg, transport the Borg to the holding cell, the security cell. And I thought it was interesting, Fritz. I don't know if you noticed it too, or I'm sure you noticed it. But I thought it was interesting that as he was leaving the bridge, of all people that you'd least expected, it was Data that recognized there was something emotional needing to be addressed here. And it was backwards. You would think, well, the emotional empath here is Troy. Right. You would have thought, well, she's going to do something. No, it was Data who said, this something needs to be done because Picard's undergoing some duress here. He looks directly at Troy and says basically, hey, go talk to this guy. Did you notice that, Fritz?
Yeah, right. I saw that Data turned around and looked at Troy, and she noticed him looking at her, and she went over to talk to Picard in his ready room. So yeah, I also noticed it. I thought it was surprising, because you would think Troy would be right on top of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they're trying to say with that scene, other than it was just the logical thing at that point is to expect that Picard would have had a hard time emotionally dealing with this.
Yeah, although I don't know why Troy wouldn't have picked it up on her own. It's her job.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. I think it was,
exactly.
yeah, I think it was just a directorial decision to kind of add a little more drama to the scene. I think that's
Yeah.
what it was. Yeah.
From there. Okay, so Troy follows Picard to his room. He lets her enter, and she starts probing him as to whether he's having an emotional reaction to being confronted with the Borg again, after what he'd been through, and he assures her that he's still got complete control of the situation, that he's making the logical decisions, he's not letting his emotions influence what's going to happen. So he sets that aside. I guess Troy accepts that, and they move on. So in the next scene, that they're at the detention cell where they just beamed the Borg up, and in the security cell, or not, so the cell is actually like a cage without wires on it. It's just got a force field to prevent the Borg from leaving the cell. On the outside, so it's just the Borg guy in the cell, and on the outside we've got Crusher and Picard talking about what they're going to do with this guy. And Picard is saying, is figuring out, first of all, he's asking Crusher what's wrong with the Borg, and Crusher is saying, well, he's got some problems with the biochips, and they realize, well, this is something critical to the life of this Borg, the biochips. And so Geordi's there, and they ask Geordi, can you fix the biochip? And he says, sure, I can fix it. I can heal the biochip. And this is where Picard comes up with the idea was, well, if we got access to the biochips, why don't we induce a virus into the chip? So we send this guy back to the ship, to the Borg ship, and he'll infect all the Borg, and we'll destroy, and we'll terminate the Borg, as he put it. We'll terminate the Borg. So this virus is going to spread throughout the Borg, that they're going to instill into this biochips of this one Borg, and this will be like an end around to getting to the Borg and terminating all the Borg. And so Crusher has a problem with this. She says, you talk about infecting the Borg with this like you're talking about the Borg being an infection like they're a disease. And Picard's response to that was, he says, yeah, hopefully a terminal one. So you kind of feel at this stage, you feel that Picard, whether he admits it or not, there is a sense of vengeance in there. I mean, I don't know if you read emotionally into it. It's a stretch to say I read that, but he said, hopefully a terminal disease. It seemed to me a bit vengeful.
Well, I think it's the position of almost everybody but Crusher, though, at that point. Yeah. I mean, I think everybody except Crusher is totally in favor of exterminating the Borg if they can. They all view it as an existential battle. So I didn't perceive Picard as significantly more determined to do this. There is a natural tendency that he would have some personal investment in it, and that he would want some personal vengeance. But I don't think he's being dominated by that. I thought he's being dominated by his position as a strategy, trying to do the strategically correct thing for this existential conflict.
Right, but so we're just setting the scene. We're not saying he's overly reacting, but his reaction is a normal one for someone, a commander in a battlefield, I guess, which is to want to destroy the enemy, and that segues into the next scene, which is in the meeting room with all the staff, and they're talking about how they're going to destroy. It was Geordi who comes up with this. With this mechanism of how they're going to inject this virus, and they'll do it through installing Oh, I'm sorry. That was in the next meeting room where he suggests showing them an image that's an anomaly. So, all right, so cutting back in. All right, so they're in the meeting room, and Crusher is the sole person who has an issue with Picard's idea of inducing this virus into the biochips. Everybody else is treating this as a war. And so Crusher's response is, well, even if it is a war, I mean, first of all, nobody's declared war. We've never declared war against the Borg. But second of all, even in a war, there's rules. So it's not just a blanket statement that you can excuse any action just by saying, well, we're in a war, so we can do it. She doesn't win out. Because everybody in the meeting room doesn't really recognize this as a Borg. They talk in terms of the Borg. So they've not individualized the Borg that's on the ship. They're just talking about how to destroy the Borg. And she's the only one who really sees this entity as an individual.
Right. So she's looking at it from a doctor's perspective. This bit about they haven't declared a war on the Borg is interesting. I didn't know that that was the case. I don't know how much that should influence their decision making. I think Picard's response is that, well, they've declared war on us. And the thing about the Borg is there's really no such thing as civilians in some respect, right? So you could look at this as well as, is this genocide? Because that's really what they're planning. They're planning genocide through, or Picard is suggesting genocide through a cyber virus, cyber tactics, right? So it's very contemporary here in many respects. So Crusher is pushing this argument as much as she can, and which is going to lead us into this whole individual versus collective theme, which is coming soon.
But she's like you're saying, she's the only one holding up the fort at this point. Not even Troy. Troy is adamant against giving the Borg a break. They're all on board, terminating the Borg, as they put it. Yeah. So all right. So then the next scene, we go back to the detention cell, and the Borg regains consciousness. And so Crusher says, looking at him, she says, he's probably hungry. And she says, by hungry, I mean electricity, because apparently they can create food out of any material. All right. So she says he's hungry. And Picard says, feed it. So at this point, he's still considering it a Borg, an it.
Right.
And by the way, just as a side note, I mean, I'm very cognizant of pronouns because I'm very active in the animal rights movement, and that's when people want to be abusive to animals, they call them its. And when you personalize animals, you give them pronouns, all of a sudden it's much harder to treat them as just a collective. Anyway, so Picard's still saying feed it.
Well, and also in this day, in this current era, pronouns are like all over the place in terms of social discourse. So we have.
I'm not sure, but see, it's almost depersonalizing. Pronouns are powerful because they're so personal, and we're almost depersonalizing pronouns now. It's very fluid. Pronouns have become fluid. So I don't know what the impact of that is when you make pronouns fluid. The next scene is when we get our good friend Whoopi Goldberg comes in as Guinan, and she's fencing Picard in a fencing match, and they're all in their fencing getup, and she looks like a pretty good fencer. She's holding up pretty well against Picard, and then they're talking about the Borg, and she takes a very hard line with the Borg. She's like even upset that they beamed the Borg up. We'll find out later why she has these feelings. But she's not very receptive to this dilemma that even Picard at this moment is starting to express, is that he's trying to, be somewhat nice to this Borg guy, even though he still wants to keep in mind he wants to destroy all the Borg. So then they take a little breather, they come back, and Picard hits her, and she goes ouch, and she kneels down to clutch her leg, and as she's clutching her leg, Picard gets concerned, and he puts his guard down and looks at her to see what's wrong, and as he does that, she stabs him. She gets him right in the heart, and she makes a really good point at that point. She says, you felt sorry for me, and look what it got you. And she was just trying to make a point, obviously, is that you're starting to have these emotions for this Borg, and look what could happen. You're going to let your guard down, and bad things are going to happen. So that's the end of that.
Becomes this running theme in the whole show about empathy is potentially a bad thing in a conflict like this, or this becomes, is it a bad thing or is it a good thing? It becomes part of the
it seems
underlying theme.
Yeah, the underlying theme is that in a war situation, you're going to have these dilemmas coming up, which is you're going to have fear counterbalancing empathy, and those two don't seem to play well together. They seem to be conflicting morally with people. Is that, and this goes throughout your life, is when you act in fear, you tend to do things that in retrospect aren't very empathetic. You can depersonalize people when you act in fear. So the next scene is back in the detention center, and the Borg is still behind this force field in the detention cell, and so Geordi's hooked up. He's created a hookup to quote feed the Borg by hooking him up to the electrical system. And so they put the force field down, and Geordi and Worf go into the detention cell so that Geordi could hook up this feeding pod while Worf makes sure the Borg doesn't get out of line. Geordi asks, while he's in the detention cell, he's sort of making small talk with the Borg. And he asks him, hey, what's your name? And the Borg really doesn't know what your name means. So he tells him, he says, well, Geordi asks him, what do they call you? And he says, I am, first he answers, we are Borg. That was his first answer is, we are Borg. Who are you? We are Borg. Using we. Again, noting the pronouns being relevant. And so Geordi keeps going with it while he's hooking up this feeding pod, electrical feeding pod. So he eventually Geordi gets out of him. The guy says, I'm 3 of 5. And Geordi recognizes, well, there were 5 of you that crashed. So that's probably referring to the 5 members of your team, and you're the number 3 of that. And this is the first moment where as a viewer, you start to get sucked into this, the Borg being an individual. He leaves Geordi with saying, why do you do this? It's not registering to this Borg, why they're feeding him, basically. Why is he feeding him? All right, so the next scene is they've beamed the Borg into the sick bay with this time it's Geordi and Crusher in sick bay, and the purpose for Geordi being in sick bay is they're trying to figure out how what's the best mechanism. They want to run some tests on the Borg to figure out what is the best mechanism to create this virus that's going to wipe out, that's going to terminate the Borg. And so they're asking him a bunch of questions in order really to probe him to figure out how to use him as a tool to destroy the Borg. And what's sad, and I would have to say this is a sad episode in general, but what's sad and intentionally sad is they make this Borg seem so innocent. They chose to make him an adolescent to begin with, to make him seem more innocent. But Geordi's asking him questions in order to destroy his race, right?
Mhm.
And this Borg is responding innocently and responding in questions himself that are innocent questions. You know, he's asking childlike questions, whereas Geordi's, at least at first, asking questions to figure out how to destroy. That's the motivation for this encounter, is to run tests to figure out how to use this Borg to destroy their race. I mean, didn't that strike you as sad, the contrast initially? I mean, it changed over the course of the conversation. But initially, the motivation for this conversation was to find out weak spots in order to instill this virus.
It was a decision, artistic decision on their part. I mean,
Yeah.
I could imagine another Borg individual, if you will, who would not have been as meek as this particular guy was.
Unthreatening.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, the Borg are supposed, there's a little bit of a, I think it's a little bit of a cheat on their part. As you were saying in the previous episode, you thought that the creators were making Data sympathetic by giving him a cat and so forth. And
right.
I think they did the same thing, even more so in this case with the Borg, because the Borg, you know, I'm sitting there thinking, well, the Borg have absorbed so much knowledge, and they had Picard. They should know a lot of the things that this guy's pretending not to know.
Mm-hmm.
And the only reason for him not to know these things is to give the writers a chance to introduce them. So I mean, he should know what a name is, for example, right? Yeah. I mean, the name, his playing innocent about not playing innocent, but his ignorance of what a name is allowed them to introduce this distinction between name and designation, which is good for the audience. Mm-hmm. But it's sort of inconsistent with what I would think of in terms of the Borg's collective knowledge.
That was, you know, you're pointing out something, but I think overall, I think it worked, because I didn't go into this, watching it a second time, expecting to feel sorry for this Borg. I think it takes good character development in a span of 45 minutes to have zero feelings for the Borg and probably antipathy towards Borg. Most of the viewers have. And to turn that into empathy. Because I resisted it. Resistance was not futile. Well, it was futile. I resisted being sucked into liking this Borg, because I could see, you know, it's telegraphed. Obviously, this is what they want you to do. But I thought they did the character development in such a way that it worked for me. I did feel empathy.
Yeah. I mean, well, we haven't gotten to some of the distinctions
in this conversation. Right? So in this question answer thing, I was going to just note that is that some of the things that I thought helped this along, me gaining empathy, was just the idea of just how alone this guy was. And by the way, in this conversation, they decide to give this guy a name. Instead of his designation, they decide to call him Hugh. It was a play off again, a pronoun. They kept saying, you know, we need a name for you, and they said, oh, Hugh, and so that's how they came up with it. But in this conversation, you start to see emotions that would make sense. You know, granted, you know, not knowing what a name is doesn't necessarily make sense, but the concept, they probe the concept of loneliness, right? Because the Borg constantly are attached to all the Borg. So that there's all these, what they would call voices in this Borg's head, just constantly in his head, so that they can make these collective decisions. They don't make decisions on their own. It's just this collective voice. And because they had him in this isolation detention center room, that was all cut off. And they were playing off the fact, well, if you have all this noise around you your whole life, all of a sudden it's all shut off, and you're just left with your own thoughts and your own desires and your own wishes. That's real. I think that is realistic, that you're going to feel really out of place.
Yeah, well, they did that, but I don't know that I had the reaction I'm not sure what your reaction to it was. My reaction was that maybe the collective is not so bad after all. That may, my reaction was, yeah, I could understand his loneliness for that reason. And my reaction was like, maybe I would rather be part of a collective like that than be an individual siloed with no,
tempting.
I mean, maybe at this point in my life, I'm feeling quite lonely. And I think maybe I'm feeling that, geez, I wish I was part of a collective where people had my back and I had their back. Honestly, my whole reaction in this episode was to think the Borg, that maybe the Borg aren't so bad, except for their plan to absorb everybody else. Like if they were willing to just continue as Borg without absorbing everybody else,
maybe asking somebody, do you want to be a satellite?
Right. If they were, yeah, exactly. So if it weren't for that, I wouldn't see anything wrong with them, at least from what we've seen. I don't think that they made a great case here about the superiority of individuality over collectivism.
No, they didn't. No,
at least from an existential perspective. They didn't really they didn't really prove to me that the humans or the people on the Enterprise, because they're more than humans, they have Worf and so forth. But they didn't really demonstrate to me the superiority of that. They, in fact, like we said right now, they're kind of showing the downside, the loneliness, as opposed to,
the downside of the humans, or
the non-Borg, right? That Borg at least aren't lonely, and they have a greater good. That, well, it's a matter of execution. They didn't show me that if the Borg had directed themselves to some other ends other than absorbing everybody, that they would be so bad off.
But I think it's such a valid point today more than ever, because so many people are being isolated. They're living in cities where they literally have never said anything to their neighbor, and it's an exact same apartment complex. I mean, again, this is a cultural thing. But I would imagine I'd be interested what Sao Paulo is like. But I know in the U.S. cities, people are very individualized, and just as a side note, when I came to California, that was the reason I came, is I liked the idea of being an individual, of not having people in my face all the time, because I grew up in a very non-individualized society, in an Arab society where everybody's in your business. You can't do anything. You can't be an individual. It's very homogenous, and the parameters of deviation from the norm is really limited. And then you come to California, or my vision of California was, you can do whatever you want and nobody's going to say anything. Well, now you see the downside. Nobody's saying anything, so they just don't really care. Nobody cares about you. So you can do whatever you want. And that's great when you're a kid. But after a while, you do all you want, and then you want something more. You want this connection. So you want to be a part of something. And in California, I think in California cities, probably most cities in the US, there are more people crammed in a smaller space, yet somehow more alone. It sounds contradictory, but that's what it feels like.
No, but this is the great problem of modernity, right? So this is the two sides of the coin of modernity. So in modernity, you have more freedom, you have more individuality, you have privacy and anonymity, if you want those things, to a greater extent than has ever been possible in the history of humanity. I mean, because we evolved in tribal societies where, for most of our physical evolution, we were in societies, collectives of like 50 or less people probably. And we knew everybody knew us. You probably didn't even have privacy such as we have now. You certainly didn't have anonymity. So, now we have those things, but I think we do value those things. I also am a very private person, and I like to have anonymity. I don't like to be sort of in the public eye all the time. or know everybody. I don't want everybody in my business, if you will. But at the same time, I recognize the downside to it, which is this, that there can be this sense of isolation, and also, the stress. There's all these stresses that I think a lot of us are experiencing, which is, we're responsible for ourselves, but then again, that means there's nobody gonna help us either, right? So. Yeah. As you and I, as we're aging, we're facing this with aging. I'm starting to feel like, well, I'm not really any use to society anymore. So society's probably disinterested in helping me as well, because you begin to feel that there's this kind of transactional relationship between the individual and the society, that at least in our modern capitalist society we're in. So I feel vulnerable in that regard, and I think that's why this particular episode struck me in an odd way. I think it hit me differently than than the writers wanted it to have the effect. I think they wanted this to be another sort of triumph of the individual,
right,
and triumph of the basically triumph of the individual over the collective, but they didn't prove it to me, as I said. And
but I think the reason it aged well was because they brought up good points in a good way. And so, maybe now in the culture of today, the analysis is going to be different. Your reaction is different, but I appreciate the fact that they raised those issues.
I do too. No, it was a great episode for discussion. I'm thinking it's a great episode for discussion. This episode could be an entire season-long discussion, because
but I mean, even just touching on the last thing that you said is, I feel this all the time and I'm really glad I moved to Arizona, so I don't have to deal with this anywhere near as much but in the cities, in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, you are really just as valuable as you are when you contribute. If you have if you don't have anything to contribute, that you are really feel discarded, and people have almost a disdain for older people who slow them down. And it's one prejudice that for some reason you're allowed to get away with. There's so many things that you're not allowed to touch, to denigrate people about.
Right.
But it's perfectly fine to make fun of a driver. Oh, they're just old. And that's funny. Like if there's a slow driver in front of you, I bet you it's an old fart. That's okay. But that's very derogatory.
No, ageism is the one.
It's okay.
Is the one unprotected group right now.
But that doesn't seem to, that nuance seems to be missed. It's like,
but to your point, and I kind of deviated, but to your point, at least amongst the youth, they have no problem criticizing the oldies, right? So
incredible.
It's like it's basically, on the one hand, they'll jump to defend some other, some group that's vilified, but in that same sentence they'll say it's the fault of all you old farts, or something like that.
They think it's okay to make fun, to make a joke out of old people. That seems to be okay with them.
It is. It seems to be okay.
They don't see how hurtful that is if you just happen to be an old person, and they don't recognize someday you're going to be an old person.
Right. So, and there was just a thread on Twitter about this, where some guy actually apologized. Some guy named Chicano Marine. So he must be under 40, and he must have made a comment about people over 40, and then he apologized, says, I'm sorry to denigrate everybody over 40. And one guy by calling you old or whatever, and one guy replied, look, I'm 60. I have no problem you calling me old. I just have a problem with you, denigrating me for being old. Or thinking that is somehow a negative.
You know what, but you know what's strange about how youth and myself treated old people is they treat it almost as if it's a state that you're just born into, that you're just an old person.
Always old. Absolutely.
You've always been old.
Absolutely. I had this.
You're an old person.
And I think this is what all youth thinks. I mean, when I was young, I thought that everybody over 50 had always been over 50.
Yeah, when you see them, a picture of them, good looking, young,
Yeah.
whatever, it's like, wow, that just changes how I viewed this person.
Well, and not only that, though, you don't realize how
you don't think
fast
they
it
ever were young.
happens. You don't
Oh, yeah.
realize. I mean, you think, well, that's an eternity. It's an eternity. Okay, they might have been young once, but that was so long ago
They're a whole other
that they've
person
been
now.
that they've been old. They've been old my entire life and a long time before I was born. And so, but then
Well, see,
as you get older, as you and I get old, we realize it's just a flash in the pan. I mean, it was like just yesterday I felt young, and today I feel I'm no longer young.
It's almost like old is not an adjective to them. It's almost like a noun, right? It's like you are old. You are, and that's what you are. That's like your race. You are an old person.
And I admit I felt that way about people when I was young.
I did too.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I thought they were always, I mean, to this day, I still think that when I see certain people. Well,
my mother's 85. And when we're driving, she'll say, oh, watch out for that old guy. Thinking it's like he's younger than you are.
Yeah. I mean, like I see that, for example, when I see certain writers interviewed or people who I've only ever seen in their elderly years, like Kurt Vonnegut. When I see him interviewed, I still can't imagine him as a young person. I still have no idea what he was like young, because I never ddid see him young.
So I thought the dynamics that were going on in this scene, in this just Geordi is just making basically small talk while he's hooking up the this feeder pod. But I thought the dynamics were really interesting because Geordi is basically trying to find ways behind the scenes to kill not just Hugh but Hugh's race, while simultaneously, so this is going on in the back of his mind, while simultaneously the viewer knows this, and Hugh is just being a kid. He's just trying to find out about the world because he no longer has this Borg Collective to give him context, right? So now he has to discover context on his own. And so he's asking these very inquisitive, childlike questions of Geordi in a way that, maybe was a little bit over the top. Maybe they made him sound a little bit more childish than he would have as an adolescent. But it still was effective. And one of the things, I'll bounce back to you in a second, but one of the more emotional points of that conversation, which again was just an ad hoc, off the cuff conversation, small talk, was Hugh asks Geordi, so, what are you going to do with me when you're done with your testing? And there's a pause there because we know that Geordi's planning to kill him after he's done testing. And Geordi's you can almost see it in it was good acting, I guess, but you can almost see in Geordi's brain that he's going to answer him, but it's starting to reach him emotionally. And Geordi's answer is, we're going to send you home. And, not spoken was to kill you and the rest of your race.
Yeah, no, it's a powerful scene. I mean, everything about this episode draws you in. You get drawn into,
even when you don't want to be,
feeling the dilemma on both sides. You feel the dilemma. You feel we all know the Borg is this incredible threat. It's an existential threat, and at the same time, we feel this. We feel empathy with them. So it's well done, and you can see Geordi's trajectory. So there's a major arc. People, they talk about the arcs of the characters, and so Geordi has the most powerful arc in this episode, going from the engineer who's just trying to figure out try how to destroy another the enemy, through their by taking advantage of their weak spot, which is their their systemic interdependency, right. And he can figure out a way to do that in a super intelligent way using a cyber virus, right? Or So on the one hand, so you can see it plays into Geordi's strength. He's got this wonderful plan. And on the other hand, he's starting to react to this person, to this individual. And so you can see the dilemma.
Continuing where we left off with Geordi having, these questions that are raised by Hugh, and he's talking to Guinan in the bar. And, he's telling her, this Borg has emotions, and you could tell that he's starting to feel guilty about trying to kill this Borg. You can sense fear in the Borg, loneliness, all these emotions that were expressed that seemed very genuine. And Guinan is not the slightest bit, or she doesn't show any empathy at all to this point. And that's when she reveals to Geordi, I guess Geordi already knew, she was just reasserting the fact that, her race was virtually entirely destroyed by the Borg, and she was one of the sole survivors, and that all these survivors are dispersed like refugees throughout the universe, and that they're all basically alone, so in a sense, she's similar to Hugh, that, Hugh's disconnected from his collective, and Guinan's collective was destroyed, and the remaining people in her collective have been dispersed throughout the universe. So Geordi's upset that she's just not connecting with him. He's telling her, look, the Borg has got emotions, and she's very dismissive. She says, why don't you go talk to him? He said, if you're so sure of yourself, Geordi's telling Guinan, why don't you go talk to him? And she just looks like really cold, and she says, I've got nothing to say to him. So he says, okay, well, just go there and listen. And that's the end of that scene. Any 2 cents on that?
No, keep going.
All right, so the next, there's a brief, it lapse just for a minute. They go to the bridge, and they let you know that the Borg are coming to collect their dead or they're injured. So they've got about 31 hours, I think they said, until the Borg arrive. So hurry up and get this virus done so we can put it into this Hugh guy, and we can get out of here. So then you get to the next real scene, which is Guinan does take Geordi's advice, and she goes to the detention cell. I mean, you talk about arcs, right? So here you have Guinan's arc of being just this really cold, almost hatred feeling inside of her towards the Borg. And so now we're going to see is, can the writers make it believable that this person who hates the Borg, who's had her race destroyed by the Borg, you can tell at this point, let's see, or I'm thinking in my head is, let's see if they can convince me that this really could happen, that somehow the Borg, this Hugh guy, could reach through that hatred and make her empathize with him. And so she walks in, and the third arc, if you want to look at it, is, look at Picard. Picard was assimilated and has this huge trauma, and he also goes through an arc. So there's 3 simultaneous arcs. I think you'd be hard pressed to decide which of those 3 is more compelling.
True. So remind me though. So what happens with when Guinan gets there?
So she calls him a thing, right? And then she tells him that. So I mean, I sort of prefaced or alluded to it prematurely when I was talking about where Guinan is coming from, but Hugh connects with her on a very deep level. So she calls him a thing. She tells them, look, you guys almost wiped out my whole race, and just very angry. And she said, and he's basically saying, all right, what happened to you? And she says, well, after you guys tried to wipe out my race, very few of us survived. And, but we did survive. There was a few of us, we got dispersed throughout the universe, but there are a few of us did survive. And so, what you said is wrong. Resistance is not futile. It's, it's tough. You almost wiped us out, but we did survive. We did survive, you guys. And so I think, and up until this point, you don't see any arc. It's this flatline hatred until Hugh makes this emotional connection with Guinan. And he says, so, if you're dispersed throughout the universe, you must be lonely. And he says, we are also, Hugh calls himself we. He says, we are also lonely, meaning we're also homeless. And I thought in one sentence, right, Mike, Fritz, in one sentence, Fritz, he created that bridge that I went into that scene very skeptical that it would be believable. But I came out of it saying, if you're at your core, Guinan is a refugee at her core. I mean, I think it informs a lot of who she is that she's a refugee. And if you can connect to somebody at something that core to them and say, you and I have that in common. We both feel that same thing. I think that's believable.
No, it was. I think that I think they all knew that they were going to be, they meaning, I think Picard and Guinan both resisted confronting this person, confronting Hugh, because they knew they would be vulnerable to feeling empathy with him, because they would start to relate to him as an individual. So they had this hesitancy to going to see him. And they were using the pronouns, as you said, they were using the it pronoun, or the thing, referring to them as things or its, in order to suppress their tendency we have, which is to want to relate to people or relate to other beings as individuals.
They also, so there's some really great conversation now going on between Geordi and Hugh. And one thing that came out of it is, when Hugh saw himself as part of the collective, it was much easier for everybody to see Hugh just as the collective, right? So it's only when he starts to see himself as being an individual that we get sucked in. And so, like one of the conversations, it talks about loneliness. And he asked Geordi about loneliness. Hugh asked Geordi about loneliness, and he says, don't you ever feel lonely? Because you don't have voices, right? You don't have all this collective voice all the time, so you must feel lonely. And he goes, yeah, I do sometimes feel lonely, but that's what friends are for. And friends are for making you feel better when you feel lonely and feel bad about anything else. And so this is another really great point in Hugh, because I'm telling you, Hugh's this guy that when I first saw him in this rewatch, I didn't really feel any empathy to the guy. And I knew where it's been 25 years or whatever since I sent it. But I kind of knew what the writers were trying to do. They're trying to suck me into him. And I really tried not to let that happen too easily. But when he says something like this point, where he says, Geordi says, a friend is somebody who makes you feel better when you don't feel good. And so Hugh says, so Geordi, you're my friend, right? Because Geordi was the guy who made him feel better when he was hungry.
Right.
So from that point forward, Hugh thinks of Geordi as his friend.
Right. Yeah, no.
That was pretty well done, don't you think?
No, it was very well done. Very well done. But it also, though, to me, I don't know, but it also, it was good, but it's in some ways it plays into my sympathy for the Borg lifestyle. Yeah. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know that it had the effect that the overall effect. It had the immediate effect of me liking this character, liking Hugh, and feeling, empathy for him, obviously. But at the same time, it also pushed me more in the direction of thinking, hey, maybe the Borg isn't so bad after all, because you're surrounded by, the thing that they haven't sorted out, let's put it this way, they haven't sorted out, and I don't know if they ever do. I think there are like 10 more episodes related to the Borg in the Star Trek universe, but there's only like one more episode. I looked it up in the Next Generation. But there are several others, like I don't know, almost in Voyager, I believe, which I am unfamiliar with. So I don't really know how the Borg resolve this issue of voice, right? I mean, what does a voice mean in the Borg collective? So because Hugh mentions, okay, I hear these other voices and now I don't hear them, so I'm lonely, right? So to me, that raises the question of what is it, is there individuality to some degree within the Borg collective? Because what are these other voices doing? You know what I mean? Like if there was no individuality, you wouldn't imagine that there would be a conversation, if you will. You wouldn't imagine that there'd be
communicate something, but it may not be it may be just communicating, hey, I'm in this location and this is what I'm seeing.
Just reporting like sensory information.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's no reason to have that through voice.
You have a computer do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing I feel when I watch Data. I didn't bring this up the last episode where they always show Data's hands moving at this super rapid pace.
Yeah, so why do you need hands?
Well, you can have, he needs hands because he's at least to facilitate
why
his.
does he need hands in that instance?
Why doesn't he just have a USB plug that he can plug, that he can connect to the computer directly? It doesn't make any sense from a technology perspective. It does make sense from from what we were talking about last week in terms of making us sympathize with Data, because he's more quote unquote human when he's using his hands.
Where does the Borg fit in? The cyborg. Why is there any human human element? I guess Borgs are half human or half biological.
Well, they're a collective of many different species, many different organisms.
Well, I guess what they're trying to do, I mean, this is a conversation about the Borg, a little bit off track, but what is the advantage of that to having just computers? Is the premise that by absorbing all these different cultures, you'll become a better person? I guess that's the premise.
It's a good question. I don't, the origin of the Borg itself, or the Borg have this self-preservation, expansionist ethos, right? It's like the universe is better off with us absorbing. Well, I think it's that they think that the collective is greater than the sum of its parts. So they want to absorb but technology and information.
Right. That's the American concept. It's a land of immigrants. The distinction, and I remember when that this time period, the distinction being made was, do you want soup or do you want a salad? I don't know if you remember those conversations, that America was not a mixing pot. Sorry. It was not a mixing pot of all these different flavors. It was a salad where you toss everybody together. They all keep their individuality, but together they create this flavor. So the Borg, I guess, is more like a mixing pot where you get thrown in and now there's just one thing. And it's that one thing is a combination, a mixture of all the other things, as opposed to a bunch of little things that keep their lettuceness and their tomato-ness separate.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it's presented that way, but that's why I say that his talking about being lonely because he's not hearing the voices makes me question how homogenous it is. Like if it's entirely homogenous, then there shouldn't really be these other voices, other than, as you say, unless they're just sensors reporting sensory information. But so it's a little bit ambiguous what's going on there in the Borg.
So let me ask you another question. So in a collective, he was trying to learn from Geordi what a friend means, and he comes to the conclusion that Geordi's his friend. So this is a new concept to him. So in a collective, you don't need friends. I guess that's the assumption. Is that because you were saying, well, this is for you, it's an argument between collective and individuality. You're leaning more towards the collective. In a collective, do you not need friends? It's just the fact you're with everybody's basically your friend. So there's no real definition of a friend.
Again, I'm not sure what what it's like to be inside the Borg. And I don't know that, I'm not saying that I'm leaning towards the collective being better. I'm just saying they didn't prove to me that it was worse, as much as they assume that anybody watching is going to assume that it's worse.
Extrapolate being in a more collective society today than you were in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Is there less of a need for friends? And pretty much you can just talk to anybody and they're cool.
Well, I mean, I think friends are kind of a special category are always needed in our world, no matter where you are, even in a more collective society. I mean, even in a tribal society, people would have individuals within that they would be closer to, that they would be friends. So it's a designation of intimacy that I think is always with us. I think friends are more important not more important, but they're perhaps relatively more important in the modern civilization, modern non-tribal society, because we don't have the general support that you would have in the tribe, right? So we don't have the diffused membership in the tribe that's supporting us. So therefore, the friends are much more friends. It's like the same thing with the nuclear family. Nuclear family is much more relatively more important in the modern society, because there's not the extended family that we used to have, right? So the burden is entirely on the burden of sort of being there for somebody is entirely on the nuclear family, and the burden for kind of our for our existential well-being is with our friends, our small group of friends. We only have a small group of friends. If you take it to the extreme,
if you take it to the extreme like the Borg, they're saying in a Borg society, you don't need friends because you have the support. Everybody supports.
Right. You have this much higher floor. The floor of support is really high because you're all in it together effectively.
Like why do I need you? I've got all the support I need from everybody else. So I don't need any one individual because I have my needs met by the collective.
Right.
But maybe in a collective, an extreme end of collectiveness, you don't need friends. You don't have friends. Everybody's your friend. I don't know.
I believe that's what they're suggesting, and I believe that
not whether it's true or not, but you believe that they're posing that question.
Well, they're suggesting also that you don't have the exist. Yeah, I mean,
you'd have to believe that because he doesn't know what friend means, and then but he has the capacity to feel friendship because he feels friendships towards Geordi. So you'd have to assume, based on that there's no need for friends when you're in
you could look at it as friends are a kind of coping mechanism for the absence of general collective support. That's why I was hesitant to say that they're more important, but when I said they're relatively more important in modern society than they may have been in tribal society, because we no longer have the floor, right? The floor of support is
there's no support.
There is no support. In fact,
in the US you could be on the street in a week. And nobody's going to give it.
In fact, this is interesting because it's a phrase in Portuguese in Brazil that I learned the hard way when some woman told me that she used this for, she had like a personal tragedy, and she's like, I'm without a floor. And, in literally it says, estou sem chão. So she meant I have no floor. And I didn't know what that meant at that moment. I didn't understand the metaphor. I knew, and so
you can drop straight through to the bottom. You can hit rock bottom, and nobody's and the richest country in the world in many ways, the United States, is littered. Now I'm using it objectifying, so I don't want to use the word littered. But there's plenty of homeless people in the streets of some of the richest cities in the world.
Sure.
And you just have to wonder how that happened. How can these people, bankers, stepping over homeless people to get to work, to make millions of dollars that they don't even know what to spend? That doesn't make them any happier. I mean, they've been proven, once you make your first million, you're not going to gain any happiness by making the second or third million. All right, so next scene is, so we just had, we had Geordi humanizing or making, seeing Hugh as an individual. So the next scene, we bounce off into Picard's quarters, and he's talking with Guinan. And she's one who couldn't relate to him because she has all these negative feelings towards the Borg, and she knows Picard has reasons to have all these negative feelings. And so she's trying to let him know that, that this Hugh guy has feelings and he's feeling lonely, and she feels sorry for him. And Picard keeps calling it. He hasn't crossed that threshold. And they just, they butt heads, where she's trying to convince Picard that that this is a living creature with feelings. And so the last scene, I guess, is the only scene where she tries to pick away at that, and she tells him, look, you're planning just not to destroy, you're planning to use this individual to destroy his whole race. Doesn't he deserve for you to at least look him in the eye before you do that? And I think, and she ends by saying, if you don't, you're going to regret it. You're not going to have a second chance once you've done this. And you kind of leave that scene with saying, she didn't convince him of anything, but I think she made a valid point to him, obviously, that you don't kill somebody. I mean, maybe deep down he has these this warrior etiquette, where you don't just coldly press buttons and kill people. That you look them in the eye and see the fact that it's a human being or a living creature, and because of the way situation is, I have to do what I have to do, but at least don't do it in a cold way. And back to my analogy with animals, it's so easy for humans to consume food because they don't do that, right? So how many times have you heard somebody say, if I had to strangle or kill my own cow or my own chicken, I would be vegan? But it's for that exact reason, is that they don't want to look their victim in the eye. They don't want to see the victim as an individual. So it's much easier to say, I love animals. Sure, I eat them, but I don't kill them. There's some butcher somewhere kills them. So it's easy to do that disconnect. So Guinan's appealing to that sense that you can't delegate killing somebody. That's going to be on your conscience, whether you like it or not. And then that's how I feel about carnivores.
Yeah.
Is that, it doesn't buy, you don't buy ethical points with me as a vegan by telling me I would never kill an animal, but, I eat them, but, I wouldn't kill an animal. Well, it's morally the same thing to me. And Guinan's appealing to Picard, saying, look, until you look that person in the eye, you're avoiding dealing with these issues. So yeah, go ahead and do what you want to do, but at least, don't hide behind not having met this Hugh guy.
Makes me think of it makes me think of the quote from Stalin, that the death of one man is a tragedy, but the death of a million is a statistic.
For sure.
And so it's a matter of scale, right? And we as humans are good at dealing with with what we think of as a human scale or a tribal scale, right? So we can we have a hard time, but we have a hard time extending that beyond our immediate circle.
Humans are not designed for the number of humans that
correct
exist.
Right. And yeah, exactly, we're not designed for empathy on a non-tribal scale.
Yeah, like a classic you're absolutely right. A classic example would be like when you see all these stories on the news is Betsy the cow escaped slaughter. And then you have the whole town up in arms saying, oh, we got to save Betsy the cow, Betsy the cow.
Right.
And meanwhile, there's like 1 billion cows that are being slaughtered every year in the United States.
Right.
We don't care about them, but we got to save Betsy the cow.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're wired that way. And in a good way, we're wired that way to care about things within our immediate circle, but we're also wired to not care for things beyond our immediate circle. And this is the major point, not the major point, but a major point of this, Robert, of the research by Sapolsky, who I mentioned that we got to follow up on, because he does a lot of what his research shows him is that things that we've our popular understanding of endocrinology and neurology is misguided, in the sense that we, for this very reason, for this issue of scale and in-group, out-group. So, for example, people think of our sort of the common public idea of testosterone is that testosterone boosts violence and anger and so forth. But in reality, and the other hormones there's like other hormones that he looks into, but it turns out that they actually have different effects depending on whether you're applying them, whether the subject is not applying them, but whether the subject is interacting with somebody he considers to be within his group or outside of his group.
It's interesting that you're giving biological explanations for what we perceive, but I think it's interesting that like a lot of these transcendental religions try to transcend that, right? They try to treat all living creatures in the entire universe as being us. When we say we, they would say we includes the universe. And you get in the opposite extreme, you have very small, limited, that's where a lot of prejudice comes in, is a limited view of what we means, just immediate family, or just people with my skin color or gender or whatever. That's the we. But I think, I do find it appealing to me as I get older to expand what I conceive of as we, and including being more and more inclusive.
One thing that bothers me a lot is I don't know if it should bother me, but it does. Admitting that it bothers me is the way in which people always have to refer to something to them. They always refer to themselves when conferring sympathy or empathy with somebody else's situation. Like they always say, like they'll see pictures of a child that's injured, or something happens, and the response online is always, oh, I can just imagine if that were my child and that had happened to them, right? And I'm sitting there thinking, well, why is that necessary? Why do you have to relate it to yourself in order to feel empathy for that? Why do you have
about you? Right.
Yeah, why does it have to come back
about you?
Why can't you just feel that about all the children, without having to make a reference to yourself, and yet this is the most common response that you see to any of these things. People are like, oh, I didn't realize, I wouldn't have thought about it, but now that I think about it in reference to myself, I feel a certain way. And
it's almost like they have to bring them into their circle to justify feeling empathy. It's like, if they're not part of my circle, then I'm not justified in feeling empathy for them. So let me see how I can bring them into my circle.
Or if they're not like me, then, they have, basically, they only want to like somebody who's like themselves.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, why do you have to,
and why can't you like the other?
Yeah. Why can't you like the other for being different, rather than why do you have to find what's common in order to like the other person? Why can't you like them for their difference rather than for their similarity?
Yeah.
I mean, I understand why to some degree. I mean, I understand that we're wired to like, I mean, I'm arguing, on the one hand, I'm arguing that we have biology. On the other hand, I'm arguing, why can't we get past that biology, given our
But people do.
given our
I mean, that's what I
rational.
was saying is in transcendental religion, they do get past the
Some
biology and
people try to get past it, right?
well,
So,
they
yeah,
try, yeah.
right. I mean, it is admittedly a struggle, but the first step is recognition, right? Recognizing
Yeah, I don't think
this
it's,
tendency, and most people don't
yeah,
recognize it. That's my point. Most people
for
don't.
sure.
Most people don't feel any shame when they type in, you know, oh, now that I see that they're similar to me,
Like me.
now that I see that it's like me or that it
Oh,
could
no,
happen to
no,
me.
no, no. Now that I see that the refugees are Ukrainian white people and I'm white people, that's a lot different than all the Syrian refugees, which I really don't give a damn about because they're
Exactly.
brown people. I first have to recognize something in them that's similar to me. And apparently, for Syrians, there's a lot more Syrian refugees than Ukrainian refugees. They never broke that barrier because somehow they're considered different than us. And then Ukrainians, it's like everybody's like up in arms. Is we got to help the Ukrainian refugees, and they got absorbed in Europe in minutes. There's no room when the Syrians tried to be absorbed into Europe. There's no room for them. And all of a sudden, the Ukrainians come in. Oh, there's plenty of room. The more Ukrainians,
Yeah.
the better. And it goes exactly to this point.
I mean,
That,
this whole period we live in is interesting in a bad way. The Chinese,
right.
Chinese phrase.
Interesting year.
Yeah, it's interesting in a bad way because I remember in 1982, I took a course, an anthropology course called Ethnicity and Identity.
Mhm.
And I specifically remember the professor, Leo Dupre, coming in and telling us, like on the first day, practically, he's like, well, this is my area, ethnicity and identity. That was his specialization.
Yeah.
And he was saying that it was a dying specialization, that it was it was no longer really important in the modern world.
Wow.
And yeah,
it's on steroids right now.
Yeah, right. And 30 years later, it's on steroids. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I always remember that. Every time I read, almost every day when I read about ethnicity and identity, I think that was like the worst prediction, ever.
Yeah, right on the money. Totally.
I have a sympathy for my Italian heritage, just like you were expressing sympathy, or not sympathy, but pride in the kind of, in the Islamic golden age. And
Yeah.
on one hand, I mean, to some degree, I remember that when you were being angry about Sam Harris dismissing the Islamic golden age, and I was thinking, well, I understand Mott's frustration, but at the same time, why is it so important for us to feel that something that happened in the past be appreciated? I mean, why isn't it important? Like, for example, we can't say that there was we don't know of any golden age for, say, the Alaskan Eskimo population, but at the same time, we should respect them as much as we would respect,
right,
Muslims for having a gold, independent of golden age.
I think there's golden aspects to every culture that people can say, this is something in this culture that I'm proud of. I mean, I'm trying to imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't trying to criticize you for having that. I was trying to think about it as an,
Right, but what if there was a culture, that had no golden age, had nothing of value to contribute to society, right? You're saying, well, so what? They're
still important. They're still valuable.
You're just as important as anybody else. And besides, I personally had nothing to do with the Islamic golden age.
Right.
But it's about, it is about legacy and, a sense of tradition. And, this is, we probably both felt that about, Notre Dame. Is like, let's say somebody said, would you have felt the same about Notre Dame football if they turned out that Notre Dame cheated and all those championships got taken away from them? Would you feel a loss? I mean, you have nothing to do with those championships. Why would you feel bad if 20 or 30 years ago, 40 years ago, these championships were taken away from Notre Dame? And first of all, would you feel bad?
No, I would. And I was admitting to you as well that I feel I do feel a connection to my Italian heritage, to my Irish heritage. I do feel kind of pride when I see um, the works of art or culture that they produced.
Mhm.
Even it's an irrational pride. It's an irrational pride, but
But
it's a
all right,
pride
what it
nonetheless.
appeals to, as you're saying, everything is irrational, right? So the emotion that it appeals to is a sense of invisibility, of you can't catch a break as a Muslim or an Arab. You can't catch a break. Even when you create the best food, vegan food on the planet, it gets co-opted. Even when you have, this period of great reason and learning, it's erased. It's just, it appeals to, I can give you a rational reason why I should care, but emotionally, it just goes to my sense of invisibility, as my identity is just being ignored. And that's what people don't like. They don't like to feel ignored and invisible.
No, I agree. It's the way we do want to be, we all want to be part of of a, of a, of a group that has a sense of value. We all want to be the people. Most populations, the original, their name for themselves is oftentimes just their word for the people.
Yeah, look, in the US, the most individualistic society on the planet starts out, "We the people."
Yeah.
That's the Declaration of Independence, right? We the people.
I mean, we all want to belong. So this is, again, part of this ties in with this show, because on the, what we're basically saying is that we all have this deep desire to be part of a collective, to be part of a successful collective. Although, but at the same time, we live in a modern world where, or at least in the modern,
Well, I think there's a little
Western
bit more
culture.
than just that. I mean, how would you work in what I was saying about not wanting to be invisible? And my concern for joining the Borg is that I would become invisible. I would be just one of many, three of five. I would not have my own. I was saying the Islamic culture is invisible, but if I get assimilated, I personally would be also. What is it about humans that need to feel visible? I mean, because I think that need to feel visible is the source motivation for all creativity. Is you have something you want inside you want to express to make it visible, and when that's ignored, especially unjustly ignored, it really bothers people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I admit that the need to be visible, to be individually important, to be appreciated is another deep-seated desire. I mean, these are prime directives in our biology.
But more than just individually, I'm saying I have a need for the Islamic Empire to be recognized for what it was, and for Arabic food to be recognized for what it is, and it makes me angry when it's not.
Yeah, because you feel it's a reflection of a negative reflection on yourself.
Yeah.
And you were saying that even if you were in the Borg, you would feel a loss of that. You would feel less important, so to speak, being in the Borg, or less valuable here.
Well, no, I'm talking from a getting the rational side of it aside. I'm talking about the emotion. The emotion I feel of why I could never live in a big city is there's nothing I could do to be visible in a big city. I'm surrounded by, millions of people. How could I possibly be an individual amongst millions of people, or recognized as an individual?
Mm-hmm. You have to adjust your expectations to some degree you're not going to be able to be famous in a way that, I mean, this is why people today, why we do we have these cult of fame, because all of us want to be,
Serial killers.
We all want to be known. We all want to be respected. It's like the death of a salesman,
Mm-hmm.
Even a small man deserves to be respected, and we all want that. And it's hard to find in our society unless you find your own small group within the larger group. So,
right.
I mean,
I feel that gives me that sense of comfort of, it being, like you said, and maybe I'm discovering what you're alluding to, of what I'm designed for, that human happiness is much more achievable on a much smaller scale. That if you try to live in a 1 million person city, you'll find that we're not designed for it. And you try to live in the boonies, and seems much more natural, and you can get through life a lot easier that way.
Well, you can do it in the city. I think that you have to work to kind of integrate yourself into a group within the city, a group of like-minded or like people with hobbies that are similar to yourselves.
But you're constantly reminded with all these people around you that how insignificant you are.
Yeah, it's true. It's not easy. Although these are, I think we have, in some respect, this is what I would call a problem of luxury. I mean, people who are at the bottom of or far worse off than us don't have this. They don't have existential problems. They have problems of, much more severe problems. So,
yeah,
I mean, we're fortunate to have these as our problems, as opposed to more fundamental problems.
The next scene is so we had Geordi. So this is like a virus, right? So this virus that Crusher created, that this Borg guy is an individual, starts spreading throughout the Enterprise. So she spreads the virus to Geordi. Geordi spreads it to Guinan. And so now Guinan's turn to spread the virus to Picard. And so she basically tells him what Geordi got him to do, what Geordi got Guinan to do, which is.
So you're using virus in the sense of like a meme. The meme started with Crusher and moved from Crusher to Geordi to.
Yeah, it could be a meme, right? Yeah. So the meme of is Hugh an individual. So now it's Picard's turn to go meet Hugh. And he's very strategic about it. So he goes in there and he shows up, and Hugh immediately recognizes him as Locutus, right. From the time when Picard was assimilated. He was named Locutus. And so he says, so Picard runs with this, and he pretends to be Locutus because this is his strategic way of trying to figure out what's going on in Hugh's head, without the guard between them being, that you're the enemy or you're other than me. He's now one of us. So Picard tells Hugh, he starts just regurgitating these these sayings, these Borg things. He says resistance is futile, and Hugh responds, but what if they don't? I'm sorry. He says you need to be assimilated, and so that's the first thing he says. You need to be assimilated, and so Hugh says, well, what if they don't want to be assimilated? Picard was saying we need to assimilate all these people, and he says, well, Geordi doesn't wish to be assimilated. Geordi'd rather die than be assimilated. And he says, Geordi must not die. Geordi's my friend. And, he's expressing his own feelings towards Geordi. And he concludes by saying, because again, this Locutus is saying basically we need to assimilate the whole Enterprise. And Hugh says, I will not assist. He says, and he just concludes by saying, I'm Hugh. I'm not a Borg. I'm Hugh. So it's a complete conversion from seeing himself as a collective, which made it easier for everybody on the outside to see him collectively, to now he's seeing himself as an individual, making it very difficult for others not to recognize him as an individual. And that's pretty much how that scene ends.
Yeah, that scene was amazing. I mean, it actually surprised me the way that the tack that Picard took. He did it so well. I almost thought to myself, wait, is he actually having a relapse? Is he relapsing to maybe Picard's been a double agent all along? I thought that would be a potentially great little episode if he had a relapse here. And then, so that of course shocks him, right? Because now he's seeing that there is a fundamental change happening within Hugh.
Yeah, it expresses itself in the meeting room where they're in the meeting room with all the staff, and Picard now recognizes that Hugh's an individual, and he recognizes he can't use Hugh the way he had wanted to. He can't use him for the ends. I'm sorry, for the ends that they had wanted. Yes, they do want to defeat the Borg, but the means to him was no longer acceptable. We can't use somebody to achieve those ends. So he's like, okay, now what do we do? Is he's going to trash this idea of using Hugh to destroy the Borg and to annihilate the Borg, basically.
Well, he's against using the cyber virus.
But just what happened in the scene was they started going back and forth about, okay, well, we're not going to use Hugh. They decide we're not going to use Hugh to destroy the Borg. So should we erase his chip, his microchip, so that he doesn't remember anything that happens? Otherwise, he's just going to convey whatever he learned to the Borg, and they're going to know everything. And should we erase his chip, which is effectively killing his identity, right? Because that's he's learned to be Hugh, and that would be erased. So that would be the end of Hugh. And then they come up with this, I can't remember which one, it was maybe Picard, comes up with the idea, well, instead of erasing the chip, let's keep his memory intact. And maybe instead of destroying the Borg, we can basically defeat the Borg by spreading this concept of individuality that Hugh has. Since they're going to absorb all of his memories, they're going to also absorb this concept of his identity. Yeah, and then is what?
Selfhood?
His selfhood. So selfhood could spread throughout the Borg. And so, in a sense, they would be defeated because they would know, they would no longer try to assimilate everybody. They would have their own selfhood. And so that seemed like a good compromise. Is, yes, so they decide that they agreed that that's what they're going to do. They're going to, Picard says, we're going to let him keep his memory. We're going to let him be absorbed into the collective, and we'll let his individuality be assimilated into the rest of his selfhood, be assimilated into the Borg. And he says, well, wouldn't that be the most pernicious program of all?
Right.
To spread individuality.
Yeah. So they still want to use him as a vector.
There's one more sentence to that scene, and then we can discuss it. So that the scene ends with, so everybody's happy, we've come up to a good compromise. And then Crusher crushes the moment. And she says, well, yeah, but what if he doesn't want to go back? And that's how that scene ends. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, so they still want to use him as a vector, but in this case, a vector for the meme of individuality.
And that's Crusher's point. That's Crusher's point, is you haven't accepted his agency yet. In the end of the day, it's his decision.
Good. Yeah, good point. Okay, so continue.
All right. Yeah, it's good. So yeah, we can discuss this more because it leads right into the next scene, which is answering Crusher's question. That last scene ends with Crusher saying, well, what if he doesn't want to go back? So now it's Geordi, his buddy, and Picard talking to Hugh and trying to explain to him these options. And because Hugh's surprised, he's not familiar with the concept of having a choice. And so they're giving him a choice. They're saying, look, do you want, you can stay with us and we'll grant you asylum and you can continue being Hugh, or the Borg's coming, the Borg ship is coming. We can return you to the moon and you can be assimilated back into the collective. And so he says, well, I'd love to hang out with you guys. I love being with my friend Geordi. This is what I would want to do. And he says, yeah, but if I do that, you know how the Borg are. They're going to come try to get me, and they'll probably kill everybody or not kill everybody, assimilate everybody, destroy everybody, basically, and whatever it takes, and to get me back. So the many are more important than the few or the individual. So I have no choice, but so he's basically expressing being selfless. And he says, you are many, I am one. What I want is not important, expressing pure selflessness. So they ask him, what do you want to do? Do you want to take the asylum with us, or do you want to go back? And he says, I have no choice, basically, that I have to go back because of that reason I said, that I'm just one. It's a mathematical formula, basically, that I'm one and you are many. And so I have to go back. So that's the end of that scene.
So he's willing to go. Yeah. So the interesting thing is he's willing to go. He wants to go back because he doesn't want to put his new friends in jeopardy, right? He recognizes that he's a risk to them. So he's going to want to. At the same time, though, he doesn't recognize that that he may be
still
a vector.
He's still the vector. So they still lie to him. He's still been telling the whole truth.
Yeah.
They're still using him, but in a much nicer way.
Well, they're not. No, they're not. Yeah, they didn't explain to him. By the way, if you go back, you may actually lead to the downfall of your entire civilization. But
the collective, it may be the end of the collective. There may be no more voices after you go back, and we're just using you, but we don't want you to know that. Yeah. That's a good point. Right. So, so that's kind of a sad scene, because that basically he's committing. He's on a suicide mission, because there won't be any more Hugh, and he knows this, is that he won't have his friends. Hugh per se will just be absorbed into the collective, and he won't be around anymore. But that's what Hugh's going through. He's going to lose his identity. That's what we can all agree. So to me, it's like a metaphor.
Well, he'll lose his identity if his individuality does not trigger a change in the Borg. If his individuality spreads like a virus within the Borg, then he may not. That's I don't think there was. That's the outside chance that they were thinking about, wasn't it? That's what Picard's.
Yeah, I think it was the idea is that it's going to be a seed that would spread.
Yeah, a seed.
But I don't think that it implied that what they were hoping for is that the Borg would now become Hugh, right?
No.
The Hugh per se would be just one in a gazillion, or how many Borgs there happen to be. So Hugh would disappear, but the concept of individuality would spread. So there would be all sorts of different types of individuals out there, but Hugh per se is kind of just going to be so diluted to almost be non-existent.
Really? That's not the way I interpreted it.
You thought they'd all be Hugh?
No. I thought that Picard's best case scenario was that the concept of individuality would spread as a concept, and that the Borg would sort of change fundamentally to the point where it would start to value individuality amongst its members. That was like what in which case, Hugh would just be the first of many individuals within the.
But what would happen in this process? Would Hugh eventually reemerge as Hugh?
I'm saying in the best case scenario, he would just continue to go on as Hugh, but he would be joined by many emerging other individuals within the collective.
And I didn't get that. I thought
you didn't get that was what his
right. No, I thought
his best case scenario was. I mean,
no, I thought his best case scenario would be that it was a process, that it would be a slow-moving virus that would spread throughout the Borg. But you're making it seem as if
systemic collapse.
Eventually it would lead to it. But I'm saying that the plan was that it would eventually happen. But it's not like it would the second they tap into his biochips, that instantly this would transpire. My premise was that he would institute this virus, and it would gradually, over the course of years or decades, spread throughout the whole Borg collective. So by then, he could be dead, but for sure, his sense of identity of who Hugh was would have been long gone and been assimilated into however many millions of Borgs there are, to the point where Hughness was such a small factor.
I mean, I was just thinking about it systemically, and I'm thinking, well, the Borg have absorbed individuals forever. That's what they've been doing. They've always been absorbing individuals, people that started out as individuals. When there's got to be a point when they initially get absorbed into the Borg where their individuality was still present. So it's not as if the Borg has never. I mean, that's what they've been doing all along. They've been absorbing individuals.
That sounds like a huge hole. How did you get past that?
So how is Hugh going to be any different than them absorbing millions of people previously? Wait, let me continue. So the only way that it would work is if there was something fundamentally different about Hugh, in the sense that he was already Borg, who then discovered this sense of his selfhood, this individuality. So he's coming at it from a different starting point. He started out as a fully assimilated Borg who's transitioned in a way. He's a trans self. He's transitioned into an individual, and that
so maybe there's a firewall that they've built for non-Borgs that prevents this.
You mean as they bring them on board? It's like an onboarding process. As they bring them on board, they're firewalled until they've lost their individuality, and then they're fully assimilated. It could be, but I was thinking that there was somehow that Picard and company were somehow hoping that because of the difference in Hugh's trajectory, that somehow his selfhood is different than the selfhood of people who had selves before they were absorbed. So for example,
they literally
it's not as if Hugh is reverting to the self he had once upon a time when he was part of some civilization that had been had been absorbed. He's got a totally new selfhood that grew out of his Borgness, right? So it's a Borgness plus selfhood, and that this new combination is somehow fundamentally different, and that it was this new combination that would, and I don't see how it could germinate slowly. To me, it should either be explosively, spread or killed off immediately upon his reintegration.
I would push back on that analysis, because you could just say, well, that's your opinion versus my opinion, but they didn't act like they expected that to happen, even potentially.
You're right.
They, like when they beamed just Geordi down. Oh, I'm skipping ahead on the synopsis. If they thought, well, as soon as the Borg gets contact with this Borg, with Hugh, instantaneously they'll just become individuals, they would have done things differently. They would have anticipated differently. They said, okay, well, if that does happen, what do we do? That planning process never happened. So it implies to me that they didn't expect it to happen. I think what they expected was what I suggested, which was nothing's going to happen. But we have hope that through time, this is going to spread, and that'll be our success. There was no concept of, okay, everybody's in the edge of their seat, because any second now, the Borg are going to be destroyed. You didn't get that feeling.
No, you're right. They didn't posit it as a
instantaneous thing.
All or nothing. I guess I was thinking that. Well, yeah, I guess I just have a hard time seeing the slow growth path.
All right, so Hugh decides, the many are more important than the one. So then they go to the transporter room, and this is where he expresses gratitude to Dr. Crusher for saving his life. his friend Geordi wants to basically go with him to say goodbye to him. There's a question of whether there's anything to fear because the Borg are going to be there. And then they said, well, they're not really, because Geordi's just one person and they don't really care about one person. They'll just ignore him. They care about assimilating civilizations, not just one ad hoc individual. So the last sad scene is basically Hugh saying he doesn't want to die. He says, he doesn't want to forget he's Hugh, which to me means he's going to die. So he's accepting that. So he's going on this mission. I guess he doesn't know that this mission exists, so he would say that. And in his mind, that's the end of Hugh. He doesn't know about this mission we're talking about, which is to infect the rest of the Borg. All right, so they beam him down. I'll wrap it up. Hugh and Geordi end up on the moon. The Borg come, and Hugh says to Geordi that he's going to try to remember Geordi. So the Borg come, and as expected, they just completely ignored Geordi. And the last scene is Hugh not doing what the collective is doing. Hugh turns and recognizes and looks at Geordi, which, as we were told, Borg shouldn't care about an individual. But here we have Hugh looking at Geordi, which means that after this spontaneous process that you were talking about, or quick process you're talking about, his sense of identity wasn't completely absorbed. That it remained intact.
Their clinical neurologist called Oliver Sacks, and the book that he wrote that I'm actually thinking of more than I am the movie. He wrote a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Okay. And it's a series of about 10 chapters, where each chapter is a different, his Oliver Sacks's accounting of a different clinical case that he, as a clinician, encountered during his career, where he treated people with brain ailments. A lot of them were, either brain disease, degenerative diseases, or they could be physical accidents that cause brain trauma. And the issue that he deals with, it to some degree, the core of the book is really about this question of whether or not what is a person when they no longer have their memories, where they no longer have their have their memories. One of the most prominent aspects of the book, and it's some ways it's a book that is difficult. The circumstances that the people are in are all difficult, but it's an optimistic book, because in some respects, all of the people in almost every story, there's kind of a compensatory effect where the people who have been injured have developed some other faculty which compensates for the one that they lost to some degree, or in a way that becomes they wind up with an exaggerated, almost superpower to compensate for the not so much to compensate, but it just happens that they wind up with this kind of superpower. And but he does raise the question of, is it the same person? Is it the same? Right. Are these the same people they were before their trauma? They're obviously people still, but are they the same people they were before their trauma? Mm-hmm. So, it's a great. He
doesn't answer that question, right? You don't get any definitive answer.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think what my experience was. He's sort of non-judgmental about it. The guy's unfortunately he also died recently. Oh, my hero. He would have been okay. We talked about, I said to you, we should come up with our list of who we would like to invite to dinner or have on our podcast. And Oliver Sacks would be in any of my top 10 lists of people to invite to dinner, to have a conversation with. Oliver Sacks he would be right up there. I mean, probably number one, because
are there videos of him?
Yeah, he's charming. He's so charming. He's just a delightful person. He's like, you know how I said Data to me was like the person acting in the good faith.
Mhm.
For me, Data is like why I was surprised that you had a kind of antipathy to Data, because to me, Data was like the epitome of an agent acting in good faith, if we accepted Data as agency, which maybe is the question that you were raising. But Oliver Sacks to me is like the epitome of a human agent acting in good faith. I mean, he's so he's empathetic in the way that we want, that I was suggesting we need to be, which is he doesn't relate everything to himself, right? He doesn't have this selfish empathy. Right. He has a disinterested or not disinterested, but he doesn't have to be invested. He doesn't have to be invested personally to relate to these people, to relate to their problems. He has a kind of, a very disparate empathy for everybody's situation. And he's able to see it with the eyes of a scientist, but also with the heart of a human in a way that is unparalleled. I mean, this is why he's extremely popular. He's celebrated around the world as for this very reason, for this kind of combination of scientific intelligence and combined with human insightfulness, or insightfulness to what it is to be human and undergo these types of trauma. And he always goes back to the fundamental issues, like what does this really mean about what's the bigger picture, about being a personhood, if you will.
But I have my chores to do, so we got to end it.
Signing off,
off,
guys.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Ciao.
Till next time.